Thank you everyone for attending today's CAMMS Risk Incident webinar. As we mentioned on the invite, it is ideally for existing users of the system to give them a bit of an overview of some hints and tips and tricks and use case scenarios and that sort of thing within the product. However, we do recognise that some of our clients don't have the product yet, but they are interested in exploring the opportunity to see what the system has to offer. So I will give a really high-level overview just so that you're at least familiar with some of the terminology to do with the product, and then the rest of the session will make a bit more sense. With that in mind, I will give you a really brief overview of the system, how it hangs together, and we'll go from there. So what I have here is the CAMMS Risk Incident home screen. It's one of two home screens for users. They can view either the register view or they can make use of the quick update view within the system. The incidents within the system follow a workflow process. That workflow is based on incident type. So you can have many different incident types, and then each type has a different set of preceding steps. Those preceding steps then appear as tabs if we open up an incident details record. So across the top, we've got, in this instance, a public medical document, incident details, investigation, linkage, action, and close. Those are all optional objects within a workflow. Our workflows do have the capacity for standard objects. Each tab is an object, and some of our standard objects include things like the investigation, linkage, action, close, documents, and then we have the ability to build custom objects from scratch as well. The incident details is a standard object. It has some standard fields, but then you can add as many custom fields as you'd like as well. The ability to then build up your framework for capturing an incident is it's quite robust. You can use or make use of multiple different input types, be that single text, multi-text, drop-down lists, locations, multi-select lists, single select lists, date time, all sorts of bits and pieces. And obviously it ties back to the rest of the CAMMS risk and CAMMS framework. So staff that you've already entered into the products come through automatically for those sorts of lists. Business units, service profiles, all of those can be utilized and leveraged upon within the product. Each of those selections can be tied to a decision point as well. And when I say decision point, I mean from a workflow perspective. So you can then trigger what objects, what tabs will display based on what people are selecting. And then we have an email service that sits on top of all of that. So there are a whole bunch of different triggers. I'll touch on some of them as we discuss various bits and pieces to do with best use case scenarios and best practice. What can trigger an email and how that can be used within the product as well. The email invite did have a couple of different bits and pieces in it that we would be covering today. What I've done is just slightly rejig that. So what I'm going to do is start talking about the way that we can view and work with prioritization of incidents within our product. I'll then talk about how we can go about capturing incidents not only on the desktop app, but on the mobile app. How we can go about assigning and utilizing responsibility within the product, which then feeds into actions. Linking our incidents to risks. It's a really key component. We don't see done typically overly well, even when people have manual systems or different systems and they come across to us, they haven't been linking their incidents to their existing or new risks. And what we've found is that it's a really valuable, really powerful mechanism within the tool to give them more insight into not only their risk framework, but day-to-day activities and that sort of thing as well. So we'll touch on that in a little bit of detail. We'll look at closing out incidents and how that process can work, and a little bit of evaluation of incidents and investigations. So we'll start at the top of that list and start talking about prioritizations. The way we do that is utilizing a rating mechanism. In this instance, we're talking about consequence. So we've got a rating here on our register view up front of actual consequence and potential consequence. Those fields can be relabeled so that you can change the terminology, but what they allow us to do is really highlight up front in your face what's occurred and potentially how bad it could have been. The benefit for that is it's clear and concise. You can use as many different rating categories as you need in that sort of consequence capacity, whether you want 5, 3, as granular as you need it to be. The colors can then be assigned so that it stands out and it's obvious when something really bad has happened, or something not too bad has happened, but it could have been a lot worse, so that then you can go and address that appropriately. If you're in a large organizations with a lot of incidents, it helps highlight those so that they don't get lost within the forest of incidents, and you can treat them appropriately, potentially look at new controls, new actions, or anything like that. So how do we actually get that information in there? It's really simple. It's on the incident details screen, and it is a standard component of the incident details capture. Down the bottom in this instance, we've got our 2 ratings. We've got our actual consequence and potential consequence. This particular client has utilized a simple rating mechanism for potential consequence. It's just a drop-down list, but they can select from insignificant, minor, moderate, major, or catastrophic. And then when they're actually determining their actual consequence, there is a matrix pop-up. And what that allows us to do is choose the consequence based on the headline risk category. The result of that is there is a fair bit of detail that actually sits behind that decision that they're making. So if they're saying that it's a financial issue and the consequence was a financial impact, and that's the headline issue, if they're saying it was minor, that means it cost between $90,000 and $900,000. So it's really allows you to be specific and have a comparison for apples and apples. You're going to get consistent information across the board that you can trust and rely on and actually make judgment calls, rather than someone just subjectively suggesting, I feel like this was a moderate or a major. You've got a bit of detail that actually sits behind that, which we find works really well. In terms of actually creating new incidents within the system, what we do is leverage off a consistent and common process within the CAMMS risk framework. So on the left-hand side, we have our plus button, the plus new, and then we can choose to create a new incident, or alternatively at the top of the records register, there is a plus new button there as well. So if I click plus new, I get the option to start filling in the details. So I can choose my event type, which will drive the initial start of that workflow register. Across the top where I get all my different objects, I can then start making the appropriate selections down the page. I can choose what categories it links to. I can choose an event. I can type in an event title, description, choose a location, and so on. I can start actually building up that selection. You notice that the reported by option has pre-selected me as the logged in user. Because it's a standard field, that means it's going to grab me directly from the list automatically for that sort of field. The responsible officer needs to be selected. I don't have my manager selected or linked to my account, so that can be subjectively chosen. And then we can choose what area of the business I work in as well. Conversely, if I was out and about and I wanted to actually log an incident from my phone, I could do that as well. So on my mobile app, I've got our CAMMS incident app, and I can click the add new button, and I've got the same input form that I was just looking at on the desktop. So I can choose my event type. I can then make selection of my categories, and every other field that I've had is already in there. I can choose to allow it to grab my current location and pop in the GPS coordinates there. So if I have spotted an incident out and about outside the office, or a pavement or a road or anything, I can actually tag exactly where that's occurred, and that comes back into the system and can be utilized as well. We'll touch on that later in the demonstration and discussion when we talk about evaluating incidents. And then I can do my actual consequence selection as well. So if I click on actual consequence, I can choose the appropriate category, and then within that, I'll be able to choose what level is appropriate. So each time I make a selection here, it doesn't just jump and save. It gives me the option to review the selection, review the detail that's been put in there, and then hit save. So it stores that information so that it's consistent across the framework there. The next thing I wanted to talk about was responsibility. And that's why we've got that at the headline component of the incident capture. On the incident details, we've got responsibility area. We've got the ability to say who's going to be responsible for this. Now, whether that needs to be a person's manager or the person reporting it, that can definitely be set up. But what it allows us to do is actually give them some ownership into this incident process. Because they're standard fields, it does tie back to the workflow. It does tie back to the email notifications, and it ties back to the quick update screen. So immediately up front, as a result of capturing this initial information, a whole bunch of things are going to happen in the background, which drive ownership of the incident within the system and ensures that the information isn't just stored in a spreadsheet. It doesn't just go off into the ether. It is used to see this incident through to completion. So firing off an incident will start the ball rolling in terms of allocating responsibility and highlighting that. But it goes further than just this initial screen. So obviously, I'll get an email saying I've notified. My manager gets one saying I've put something in and they need to go and review. And potentially my business unit manager might get an email as well. Now, if my manager and the business unit manager are the same person, they won't get two emails. They'll just get the one. The system's smart enough to say that, well, if we're sending out an email for record creation and a particular user that we're sending emails to highlights both roles, it's not going to send them two emails. So it's really quite useful to be able to turn on that email, but have that safety net that people aren't going to get email fatigue. If I go back to the incident register and open up an existing one, we'll get a bit of an overview as to a few more bits and pieces throughout the life cycle of the incident that give us a bit more depth in terms of responsibility and ownership. The next component where that really kicks off is our investigation. Again, it's a standard object within the suite, but it's one that's definitely worth using in addition to that initial incident details. What it allows us to do is conduct an investigation process or requirements gathering or an analysis section, and you can identify primary and secondary officers who will also get email notifications to say, you have been allocated and here's how you actually get in there to access the product. It has a hyperlink, obviously, on the email notifications, and the entire body can be configured, but it can also be fleshed out with placeholder text, which will hydrate from the rest of the incident as well. So it's definitely something that if you're not already making use of, it is worth having a look at. You can enable it in the test environment or have a chat to one of the customer success managers about it and say, well, we're not using investigations. We've sort of done it slightly differently. Could we have a look at it? More than happy to sort of talk you through it, how it could be used and what some of the benefits are there. But as a result of assigning someone as an investigator, that will go to their quick update screen as well. So the quick update screen, I'll jump to in a little bit, but what it does is it gives you access to not only your incidents, you've got investigations, you'll also have actions and sign-offs as well. So consolidates that information and a good one-stop shop if you are using the incidents for people to actually get in there and see their ownership components, their responsibilities. Obviously, the emails are a great reminder, but to have it all consolidated in a consistent and common framework is really nice. So that's the investigation. The third component I wanted to talk about in terms of responsibility is actions, which is a good segue because the third thing on my list to talk about is how the actions work within the system and what some of the benefits of that are. So the actions in here are designed to be isolated to incident. They're not designed to take over your business planning process or feedback into your strategic plan. They're more designed to be short-term. Obviously, there are instances where you might identify a corrective action as a result of an incident that does need to feed back into that larger, broader scale planning process. And we've found that the correct mechanism and the best practice for doing that is actually via the linkage to a risk. So I'll go through that a little bit later. But if we talk about incidents isolated to actions, one-on-one, obviously what you have here is a corrective action for this particular incident. Someone's been assigned responsibility and they've got a short deadline or time frame to actually go in and undertake that completion. So I can go in here and see any further detail that might be appropriate. I can have description and comment and the completion date. I can also add in additional custom fields as well. So the actions can be more than just a simple one-liner. You can put a bit more guts to them. I've seen people add additional drop-down lists and combo boxes to say, have you had this signed off and reviewed within a particular action, just to give it a bit more detail and scrutiny to see those through to completion. But we do also get performance traffic lights as well. That will also feed into the evaluation stuff at the end, which I will come back to. Speaking of risks and how actions can link to risks, I will jump back one object, one tab, and look at our linkage object. What I have here is an incident which has been linked already to risks. What the system allows us to do is obviously flag any incident against any of our risks that have already been set up in the system. The way that works is you push the new button, you choose the type of linkage, and then you can choose from the registers. I've chosen risk, so then I can go ahead and say it links to the operational risk register, and then I can choose from the selections to say it links to these particular risks. I can choose to select one of those and add it to my list. In this instance, I chose the one that's already linked to, and I can't re-add it, but if I be a bit more careful, there we go. So now it's linked to 3 risks. Great. But what that allows us to do is actually start highlighting within the system risks that have incidents occurring against them. And it sounds basic, but what it actually does is it allows us to put a bit more science and a bit more rigor against our risk rating mechanisms. So when we're typically undertaking a risk rating, we look at likelihood and consequence. Well, the likelihood is being directly measured here in terms of the number of incidents that are actually occurring against that particular risk. So over time, what you're actually able to do is look at your likelihood ratings against any and all of your risks to say, are they correct? Are they accurate? Have we said this is unlikely to occur, and yet receiving dozens of incidents against, or 2 or 3 or what have you? Maybe you need to then look at changing that likelihood. It wasn't unlikely to occur, it's likely to occur based on real world data. Or do you need to look at potentially revising the controls that you put in place against that particular risk? Do you need to be able to say, these controls aren't being effectively monitored, they're not being reviewed, we're going to increase the time frame that occurs within to bring about a reduction in the number of incidents against that particular risk. And conversely, it doesn't have to highlight the bad. It can actually highlight the good. So potentially you've got controls in place that are working really well and you hadn't measured them appropriately. You might have said, I think they'll be okay. And it turns out they're great. You haven't had a single incident over a period of 9, 12, 18 months. And then you can look at potentially reducing the likelihood assessment against a particular risk to reduce that risk rating, potentially falling it in line with your current risk appetite or your future risk state. So it's a really beneficial mechanism to actually be able to close that loop of incident through to risk. Speaking of closing things, the next item I did want to talk about was our close object. This particular object, again, has some default fields or standard fields. Those are typically who it's been closed by, which is the evaluated by in this instance, who is doing that closing, when they're closing it. So it will default to today's date and time or when you are actually closing it, and what the status is, so opened or closed. Those are your default fields, but what you can do is obviously add in additional ones and resequence them as appropriate as well. So in this particular example, we've put in a further comments field, which we can update as appropriate. We've got the person who's doing the evaluation. We can determine any selections, drop-down list, new notes, flag the date and time when it's actually occurred, and then change that status, so open to closed if we need to, and hit save. The purpose of that is it gives you more oversight as to who's actually running those risks, running the incidents within CAMMS risk, who's closing them out, so who's actually responding to them appropriately, how long it actually takes to close a risk. So from end to end, it gives you oversight as to how long things run for. But you can also tie it back to the workflow in terms of access. So if you'd like, when we actually trigger that close, you do have the option to lock out an investigation, lock out the details so that people can't go back in and actually modify the records posthumously. You can't actually go in there and adjust things after the fact. After it's been flagged as closed, it's done and dusted. Obviously, there are mechanisms that we can employ so that an administrator can reopen it, but not typically done. And you have the control in place from an audit perspective to say, this is the incident, this is what was captured, this is when it was closed, and that's all that was entered. So it's really good in having that auditability and comfort for that incident process. Obviously, the email notifications can be triggered against that as well, and you can actually tie a sign-off process to that. So someone says they're closing the incident, then it's a sign-off to say, was it appropriate? Was it done timely? Was it accurate? Have they put in the correct information in terms of when they're saying they closed it and when they actually triggered it? If you do need to have some checks and balances, the system's more than capable of accommodating that sort of more complex process. Once we've actually captured all this information, it's great to have a nice massive register of incidents that have occurred and been closed out. And the register can be filtered to not show you the closed items if you'd prefer. Obviously, from a demonstration perspective, it's nice to have a few more records there for us to see. But by default, you can actually set it up so that I would only be seeing the 2 open records. But there is more analysis that can be done other than looking at this register and ordering and filtering via this screen. That's all good, but there is another one. The analysis section under Analysis Incident Analysis gives us a pre-built breakdown of incidents within the system. Starting on the left-hand side, we have the organizational hierarchy. And what that actually allows us to do is break down those risks and group them by the org hierarchy that we've selected within the Incident Details tab. So on that first tab, for every single incident, we have the ability to say what business unit or what service profile this incident occurs at. And then as a result, we can start looking at that within the analysis section. We can say, show me all the risks that occurred within the finance and corporate section or property or what have you. And that breaks it down and changes what we see on screen. What we see on screen, though, is pre-built and predetermined. It utilizes the standard fields from a number of these different objects. That's why it's really good to use them, because you get that benefit. You can label replace them and add different fields and options, and it will pick those up here, which is nice. But we are sort of locked in at this point for those particular widgets. Across the top, though, what we get is a potential consequence, actual consequence, and close status. And then we look at actions by status. We're looking at incidents and when they occurred. If you're utilizing the risk component, you'll get a bubble chart in here that highlights how many incidents are occurring with what severity and so on and forth. And then at the bottom of the screen, we've got incident type and risk ratings. And they're nice little bar charts and so on, but the strength actually sits behind them. If I select any of those sections, I actually get a breakdown of what incidents occurred within that portion. So I can see here what my 5 moderate incidents are, or I can choose here to see what my 2 open incidents are. What actions have I not yet started? Or rather, what actions have someone else not yet started? And it is me, James Smith. But you know then who to go and follow up to say, you have outstanding actions. We've closed your incident, but given you some actions and you haven't actually treated them appropriately. You haven't signed them out. You need to go in there and do that. So you've got some recourse in that respect. And you also then have the ability to do a location analysis. So as I showed you on my phone, when I started logging an incident, you do have the ability to flag where an incident occurred. You can choose the GPS coordinates directly, or you can log in on the web interface and update them as well. So what you're able to do is drop a pin where that incident has occurred. So then you can actually look at geographical regions where more incidents occur than others, and look at hot zones and heat maps and that sort of thing as well. Okay, well, we might leave it there. Hopefully that was of value, and you can see making best use of some of the existing functionality within the product that you might not already be doing could add some additional value to your use of the system. Thank you for your time, and I'm sure we'll be in touch.